take over his job. So he wasn't really coming from a highly principled area, in my perception. It wasn't, it was a question of stubbornness. It was a question of bitterness. And I thought, well, I'm a young man on the make, and I know what I'm supposed to do. And Claudine's told me, and I just don't want Howard to get in my way. But at one point, I had this realization that I all through this, I was going through tremendous qualms and guilt. I knew that what I was doing was not the right thing, but I was being well rewarded, and what I was doing was legal, and in fact praised by people like Robert McNamara and people that I looked up to. And so at one point, Howard made it very clear to me that it didn't matter what I came up with for an economic forecast. If I came up with 17% economic forecast, then his electric load forecast would have been roughly in the same area. There's a very strong correlation between economic growth and energy growth in any country or any region. And so it was my job to come up with this high economic forecast, and then he was supposed to match his electrical load forecast to that. He made it very clear that he wasn't going to do that. Didn't matter what I came up with, he would come up with something between 5 and 10%. Which he figured was reasonable. So suddenly this light went off, and I said, my God, I've been relieved of the guilt. I can do what my masters have told me to do, what Claudine's told me to do, what everybody's telling me to do, come up with these high economic forecasts, and he'll come up with the electric load forecasts that are the real ones, the reasonable ones. And so I'm off the hook. They'll have to follow his electric load forecasts, because that's what the system would have to be designed with. And they should follow the economic forecast, but if he doesn't follow the economic forecast, then it's the burden's off me. So I felt so relieved. Of course, when I got back to Boston, Howard left long before me, left Indonesia because he got very sick, so we had to send him home. And he said he had all the information he could do the rest of his work from home. When I got home, my boss, who later became the president of Charles T. Main, called me into the office, and he said, I'm firing Howard Parker. Doesn't matter what you say here now, what you do, I'm firing Howard Parker, because his forecasts are unreasonable. I understand, he said to me, that your economic forecast would justify much higher load forecasts, and that you now are in a position where you could develop those load forecasts. Is that correct? He said, and I said, yes, that is correct. He said, congratulations, you've just been promoted. I took it. I gave them the load forecast they wanted, and my star was bright. I eventually became a partner in the firm, chief economist with a big staff, wonderful people working for me, and it's all in the book. I was compromised at that point, beyond reconciliation.
But you would do things regularly, for instance, sticking with Indonesia, that would feed your doubt. For instance, if I remember correctly, in Indonesia, you went out with a local person there who took you to meet people who lived there, and they openly challenged in casual conversation some of the things you were doing.
That's correct. I've always liked people a lot, and originally I wanted to be a journalist, and I was a Peace Corps volunteer. I loved being with the people. So when I was in Indonesia, this young man, his name was Razzie, who I lived in the same house as him. He lived in the guest house. His mother ran the guest house where our team lived. And he introduced me to a lot of his friends, and I loved being with them, these Indonesian people. I learned to speak Bahasa Indonesia quite well at the time. And so I spent a lot of time with them. And yeah, they were quite radical. And there's a whole series in the book about some of the experiences I had with them, going to puppet shows, their politics, their anger at what we were doing in Vietnam. And I agreed with them, and they were quite stunned that I would agree with them so much. And they took me into these amazing, beautiful parts of the city, the old city of Bandung, which is in West Java. We were working out of Jakarta and Bandung, and I was traveling around a lot of Indonesia. I was always shocked by how there were no other foreigners in those parts of the city. No other foreigners really hanging out with the Indonesians. There were quite a few foreigners, oil company people and people like my own team. We all hung out at these private clubs and the fancy restaurants, but didn't hang out with the Indonesians very much. And I did, and I really, really enjoyed it. And they questioned me a lot, and they pointed out that Arnold Toynbee, the great British historian, in 1954 had written a book called Civilization on Trial, which said that in the long run, the Muslim people are the biggest threat to capitalism, to the U.S. way. Back in 54, he said it isn't communism. That's not ultimately a threat because it's not spiritual enough. It's not based in any real strong principles. For a culture to succeed, it has to be very principled. And he demised the fall of capitalism, what he called the West, because he said ultimately we won't be that principled either, and that the Islamic world would rise up because they have these strong beliefs in spirituality, and they don't believe in usury, and they don't believe in lending money. And these young Muslims in Indonesia pointed that out to me and said, you guys are in trouble. This is back in the early 70s, and they said, the Muslim world is watching, and we don't like what we're seeing. It was an amazing forewarning for, if you look at what's going on now in the world, the Muslims have become very powerful and very, very angry at us. And it isn't simply about religion by any means. The Muslim religion at heart is not an angry religion. It's a compassionate religion. But they're very angry because they see us as basically raping their world, pillaging it. And, they were always quoting statistics to me. We have a statistic that we throw around in this country a lot, that 5% of the world's population, us, the American population, consumes 25% of the world's resources. Now, that really bothers most of the rest of the world, that we're like this great octopus that reaches out with its tentacles and brings all the resources into us, and look at the lives we lead, while 3/4 of the world lives in destitution. Every day, 24,000 people die of starvation, and 30,000 children die of curable diseases every single day. And the people who live in the places where that's happening are angry, and they see us 5% of the world's population bringing in 25% of its resources, while so many of them live tragic, destitute, miserable, suffering lives, needlessly suffering. It doesn't have to happen. But an even more important statistic, I believe, is that of that 5% of the world's population, only less than 1% controls more of America's resources than the 90% at the bottom. So in fact, 25% of the world's resources are being funneled into this country essentially to serve 1% of 5% of the world's population. Terribly small. It's not even a pyramid. It's like a needle going up with a few very wealthy, very powerful people sitting on the top. It's created tremendous resentment around the world. It's what's created our insecurity. I would suggest that we will never be secure in this country, no matter how many guards we have at our airports, until we decide that we're going to be a lot more compassionate with the world. And what a great thing that is to do. That will bring us the security that we need, is when we start really opening ourselves up to the world and welcoming the world as brothers and sisters who we want to share the goodies with. And back in those days in Indonesia, these young Islamic people who I fell in love with and was working with, they saw all this. They anticipated it. And they warned me about it, and it was a very telling experience for me, very moving. And yet, I was seduced. Sex, money, and power was coming my way, man, and I was gonna take it, and I did, for too long.
So, what was your next assignment after that? What was the next big project you were saddled with, or country?
Yeah, after that, I kind of began spreading out and hiring other people to work with me. So I did a lot of work in the next few years in Panama, and I also went back to Indonesia to do the same sort of thing we'd done in Java, up on the island of Sulawesi, and Colombia, and Iran. So for 3 or 4 years, my time was very much split between those countries, and I would take other journeys into Egypt and Guatemala and many other places, and I began hiring. I mean, I became very popular within Charles T. Main because I was going along with the system, and the World Bank was loving what I was doing, and I just kept expanding my department. I became a partner. I was making a lot of money, and for the company as well as for myself. So it involved quite a few countries. But You know, the ones that had the greatest impression on me after Indonesia were Panama and Iran, and then Saudi Arabia.
All right, I want to go into a little more detail on those, but first, you had spoken about how people on your team when you were in Indonesia didn't have a grasp of the bigger picture of what was going on there. You were the single person that did. Once you started expanding your staff, were other people who were part of your staff, did they have the big picture? And then also, what about people at the World Bank and these other large organizations that you're kind of a front company for? Did they have the big picture?
Great question, Mike. And the question to the answer to both of those questions is essentially no. At the World